"Mom, we need to leave, now," I said, voice trembling. The words tumbled out before I could stop them, my heart pounding with a sense of dread that had become all too familiar. "Honestly, Claire, I can't deal with your nonsense right now," she sighed, not even glancing up from her magazine. "You're always overreacting about something." I swallowed hard, the dismissal stinging as it always did. From as far back as I could remember, I'd had these inexplicable gut feelings, warnings that would scream at me to avoid certain situations or people. More often than not, they proved to be accurate, like the time I insisted we leave a restaurant only for a horrific kitchen fire to break out minutes later, or when I pleaded with Mom to take a different route home and we narrowly missed a multi-car pileup. But instead of being praised for my intuition, I was labeled as a troublemaker, a jinx. My parents brushed off my concerns, chalking them up to an overactive imagination or attention-seeking behavior. The only one who seemed to understand was my little sister Julia, who would cling to me whenever I sensed danger, her big eyes wide with trust. That trust slowly eroded as we grew older. With each passing year, the rift between Julia and me widened, fueled by our parents' blatant favoritism. While I was constantly criticized for my oddness, Julia could do no wrong in their eyes. She was the golden child, showered with affection and opportunities that I could only dream of. "Claire, you're being ridiculous," Mom snapped, jolting me back to the present. "We're not going anywhere. Your sister has an important dance recital tonight, and we're not missing it because of your silly premonitions." I opened my mouth to protest, but the words died on my lips. It was no use. They never listened, no matter how dire the situation. With a heavy heart, I retreated to my room, the feeling of dread growing stronger with every step. Little did I know, that night would be the beginning of a downward spiral, one that would test the limits of my family's loyalty and push me to the brink of losing everything, including myself. High school should have been a fresh start, a chance to shed the labels that had followed me for years. Instead, the neglect from my parents only intensified, and the chasm between Julia and me grew wider with each passing day. "Did you see Julia's new outfit?" Mom gushed one morning over breakfast. "She looks absolutely stunning." I forced a smile, trying to ignore the pang of jealousy that twisted my gut. Of course, they had splurged on yet another designer ensemble for their precious daughter. "And her dance recital is this weekend," Dad chimed in, beaming with pride. "We can't wait to see her perform." The unspoken words hung heavy in the air. They couldn't care less about my activities or accomplishments. Not that I had many to speak of. My parents had made sure of that, constantly shooting down any interests or hobbies I tried to pursue. "What about you, Claire?" Mom asked, almost as an afterthought. "Anything exciting happening in your life?" I opened my mouth, but the words died on my lips. What was the point? They would only dismiss or criticize whatever I said, as usual. "No, nothing," I mumbled, staring down at my half-eaten breakfast. Julia shot me a smug grin from across the table, her perfect features twisted into a look of pure disdain. She knew she held all the power, basking in our parents' endless adoration while I withered in her shadow. The months ticked by and the pattern repeated itself endlessly. Julia blossomed into a popular, confident young woman, surrounded by a gaggle of admirers and drowning in praise from our parents. Meanwhile, I faded into the background, my warnings and concerns falling on deaf ears. "Claire, you're being ridiculous," Mom would scoff whenever I tried to voice my intuition. "Stop trying to rain on your sister's parade." The words cut deep, reinforcing the belief that I was nothing more than a jinx, a burden to be brushed aside. Even Julia started to treat me with disdain, rolling her eyes whenever I opened my mouth. "No one wants to hear your crazy theories, weirdo," she sneered one day, her friends giggling behind her. I bit my tongue, swallowing the hurt and anger that threatened to spill out. What was the point of fighting back? They had already made up their minds about me. As the years passed, the isolation became suffocating. I watched from the sidelines as Julia's star continued to rise, her every whim catered to by our doting parents. They were blind to her true nature, the vicious jealousy that simmered beneath her perfect facade. Little did they know that jealousy would soon boil over, igniting a chain of events that would tear our family apart and force me to confront the harsh realities I had spent so long trying to ignore. The day Julia got scouted by the prestigious Westbrook Dance Academy should have been a celebratory occasion, but as soon as I laid eyes on the slick-haired recruiter, a sinking feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. "This is such an amazing opportunity," Mom gushed, her eyes shining with pride. "Julia is going to be a star." "I don't know," I began, but Dad cut me off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Don't start with your negativity, Claire," he snapped. "For once, can't you just be happy for your sister?" I bit my tongue, the familiar taste of bitter resignation flooding my mouth. Of course, they wouldn't listen to my concerns, not when it came to their golden child. Over the next few weeks, the feeling of dread only intensified. I couldn't shake the sense that something was off about Westbrook, that their promises of fame and fortune were too good to be true. "Julia, please be careful," I pleaded one night as she packed her dance bag. "I have a really bad feeling about this place." She whirled around, her eyes blazing with fury. "Shut up, Claire. You're just jealous that I actually have talent and a future unlike you." The words stung, but I pressed on, desperate to make her understand. "I'm serious. Those people seem shady, and I don't want you to get hurt." Julia let out a derisive laugh. "Oh my God, you're delusional. Stay out of my business, freak." With that, she stormed out, leaving me alone with my mounting sense of dread. Sure enough, my worst fears were realized. Within weeks, the truth about Westbrook began to unravel. They were nothing more than a glorified exploitation ring, luring in talented students with promises of stardom, only to bleed their families dry with exorbitant fees and shady contracts. "How could you let this happen?" Dad raged, his face contorted with anger. "You jinxed this opportunity for your sister." "I tried to warn you," I pleaded, my voice trembling, "but none of you would listen to me." Mom shook her head, her lips curled in disgust. "This is all your fault, Claire. If you hadn't been so negative and discouraging, none of this would have happened." The words cut deeper than any knife, reinforcing the belief that I was nothing more than a burden, a blight on their perfect family. As the financial strain mounted, the tension in our household became unbearable. Julia grew increasingly resentful, her once bright future now tarnished by the failures of Westbrook. "I hate you," she hissed one night, her eyes burning with rage. "You've ruined everything for me, just like you always do." I wanted to scream, to shake her and make her see reason, but deep down, I knew it was pointless. In their eyes, I would always be the problem, the one to blame for every misfortune that befell our family. As the walls closed in around me, I found myself retreating further and further into a world of isolation, my only solace, the knowledge that I had tried to prevent this catastrophe. But even that small comfort was overshadowed by the growing realization that my family's love and loyalty had limits, and I had long since exceeded them. As the walls of isolation closed in around me, a glimmer of hope appeared in the form of Mrs. Reynolds, my English teacher. From the moment I stepped into her class, I sensed something different about her, a quiet understanding that seemed to radiate from her kind eyes. "Claire, can I speak with you for a moment?" she asked one day after class, a warm smile playing across her lips. I nodded warily, bracing myself for yet another adult who would dismiss or belittle me. But Mrs. Reynolds surprised me. "I can't help but notice the way you carry yourself," she began, her voice gentle. "It's almost like you're shouldering a weight that no one else can see." My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I considered brushing her off like I had so many others. But there was something about her demeanor, something that made me want to trust her. "It's complicated," I finally said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I have these feelings, these gut instincts that something bad is going to happen. And no matter how hard I try to warn people, they never listen." To my surprise, Mrs. Reynolds didn't laugh or roll her eyes. Instead, she nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "I understand more than you know, Claire," she murmured. "You see, I have a similar gift, a heightened sense of empathy that allows me to read people's emotions and intentions." I stared at her, my heart pounding in my chest. Could it be possible that I wasn't alone, that there was someone else out there who understood what I was going through? Over the following weeks, Mrs. Reynolds became my mentor, guiding me through the intricacies of my abilities and helping me to embrace them as a strength rather than a curse. "Your intuition is a powerful tool," she explained one day. but it's up to you to learn how to wield it wisely. With her guidance, I began to see the world through a new lens. The constant barrage of emotions and premonitions that had once overwhelmed me became manageable, even helpful. I started using my gift to assist friends and classmates, offering advice and warnings that were met with gratitude rather than scorn. "How did you know that Kyle was cheating on me?" my friend Sarah asked in amazement after I confronted her about her boyfriend's infidelity. "You're like a human lie detector." For the first time in my life, I felt seen and appreciated for who I truly was. The isolation that had once suffocated me began to fade, replaced by a newfound confidence and sense of purpose. But as my star rose, Julia's jealousy reached new heights. She sneered at my newfound popularity, her once adoring gaze now twisted with resentment. "Of course the freak would find a way to steal the spotlight," she spat one day, her words dripping with venom. I tried to reason with her, to explain that my abilities weren't a ploy for attention, but she wouldn't hear it. In her eyes, I was nothing more than a threat to her own fragile ego, a constant reminder of her failures and our parents' misplaced loyalty. As the tension between us escalated, I found myself caught in the crosshairs of a battle I never asked to be a part of. A battle for love, acceptance, and the right to be seen for who I truly was. Emboldened by Mrs. Reynolds' mentorship, I stepped out of the shadows and into a newfound confidence. No longer would I cower in fear of my abilities or allow others to dismiss them as mere delusions. "Claire, you have to help me," Sarah pleaded one day, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "Kyle's been acting so strange lately, and I think he might be cheating on me." In the past, I would have hesitated, afraid of overstepping boundaries or being labeled a freak for voicing my suspicions. But now, I trusted my instincts implicitly. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," I said gently, placing a comforting hand on her arm. "But I've sensed something off about Kyle for a while now. His emotions towards you have shifted, and I don't think he's being faithful." Sarah's face crumpled, but she nodded, grateful for my honesty. Word of my unique insights spread quickly, and soon more and more of my classmates were seeking me out for guidance. "Claire, you have to tell me if Brad is serious about me or just stringing me along," Amanda begged, her voice trembling with uncertainty. I closed my eyes, tuning into the emotional currents that swirled around us. "He cares for you, Amanda," I said carefully, "but he's not ready for the level of commitment you're looking for." As the requests poured in, I found myself embracing a newfound sense of purpose. For the first time in my life, my abilities were being valued, not shunned or ridiculed. But not everyone was thrilled by my newfound popularity. Julia's jealousy reached a fever pitch, her once adoring gaze now twisted with resentment and bitterness. Of course, the freak would find a way to steal the spotlight. She sneered one day as I offered advice to a group of classmates. I tried to reason with her, to explain that my intentions were pure, but she wouldn't hear it. In her eyes, I was nothing more than a threat to her fragile ego, a constant reminder of her failures and our parents' misplaced loyalty. "You're just jealous that people actually appreciate me for once," I shot back, my own frustration boiling over. Julia's face contorted with rage, and for a moment, I thought she might strike me. Instead, she leaned in close, her voice dripping with venom. "Enjoy your little moment in the sun, Claire," she hissed, "because I'm going to make sure it doesn't last." From that day on, the battle lines were drawn. Julia made it her personal mission to undermine me at every turn, spreading rumors and lies in a desperate attempt to claw back the attention she so desperately craved. But for once, her efforts were futile. My newfound confidence was unshakable, bolstered by the knowledge that I was finally using my abilities to help those around me. As the tension between us reached a boiling point, I couldn't help but wonder if our toxic sibling rivalry would ever be resolved, or if it was destined to consume us both in a blaze of jealousy and resentment. "You seriously think you deserve a seat here, Claire?" Julia smirked as I took my place at the family table for her wedding reception. The venom in her voice sent a chill down my spine, but I refused to back down. Not this time. "Of course she does," Mom chided, though her tone lacked any real conviction. "She's part of the family." Julia let out a derisive laugh. "Barely. We all know you've never really accepted her gifts." She made air quotes with her perfectly manicured fingers. Before I could respond, a familiar voice cut through the tension. "Julia, this is outrageous. Leave your sister alone, or I'll have you removed from your own wedding." I whipped around to see none other than Mr. Anderson, the father of one of my closest friends, striding towards our table. His stern gaze swept over Julia and her new husband, Rick, leaving no doubt as to his distaste for their behavior. "Mr. Anderson," I stammered, equal parts relieved and mortified that he had witnessed Julia's cruelty. "You didn't have to." "Nonsense, Claire," he interrupted, his voice firm but kind. "I would be remiss if I didn't speak up in defense of someone who has done so much for my family and this community." Julia's face flushed a deep crimson, her carefully crafted facade of perfection cracking ever so slightly. Rick, meanwhile, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his bravado deflating like a punctured balloon. "What are you talking about?" Mom demanded, her eyes narrowing at Mr. Anderson. He smiled, seemingly unperturbed by her hostility. "Claire's unique abilities have been invaluable to my business ventures. Her insights and intuition have helped me navigate countless difficult decisions and partnerships, saving me from potential disasters time and time again." I felt a swell of pride in my chest, mixed with a twinge of guilt for not sharing these accomplishments with my family sooner. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't have mattered. They were too blinded by their favoritism towards Julia to ever truly appreciate my gifts. "Is this true, Claire?" Dad asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. I nodded, holding Mr. Anderson's supportive gaze. "It is, but I never wanted to make a big deal out of it. I was just trying to help where I could." Julia's face twisted into an ugly sneer, her carefully curated mask of perfection shattering completely. "Of course," she spat, "always the martyr trying to make me look bad." "That's enough, Julia," Mr. Anderson said firmly. "Your pettiness and jealousy towards your sister have gone too far. It's time for you to face the consequences of your actions." With those words, he turned to address the assembled guests, his voice ringing out clear and authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid I have some disturbing news to share about the bride and groom." As Mr. Anderson proceeded to lay bare the sordid details of Rick's shady past and Julia's manipulative behavior, I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication wash over me. For too long, I had been the scapegoat, the outcast forced to bear the brunt of my family's dysfunction. But in that moment, the tables had turned. Julia's carefully constructed facade was crumbling, exposing the ugly truth that had been festering beneath the surface for years. And as the gasps and murmurs of shock rippled through the crowd, I knew that this was only the beginning, the first step towards reclaiming my rightful place in a family that had long since abandoned me. As Mr. Anderson's damning revelations about Rick and Julia's sordid behavior echoed through the stunned silence of the reception hall, I could practically feel the weight of years of mistreatment and neglect lifting from my shoulders. "Rick Thompson is nothing more than a con man preying on wealthy families like yours to fund his lavish lifestyle," Mr. Anderson declared, his voice ringing with righteous fury. "And your daughter Julia was all too willing to be his accomplice, manipulating and deceiving everyone around her in pursuit of money and status." Julia's face had drained of all color, her perfect veneer cracking further with each word. Rick, meanwhile, seemed to shrink in on himself, the bravado he once exuded now replaced by a palpable sense of shame and fear. "You're lying!" Julia shrieked, her voice shrill with desperation. "Rick loves me, and we're going to be so happy together." Mr. Anderson fixed her with a withering stare. "Wake up, Julia. The only thing Rick loves is your family's money. He's been using you from the start, and you were too blinded by your own greed and desire for validation to see it." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by a torrent of hushed whispers and pointed stares. For the first time in my life, the tables had turned. Julia was the one being ostracized, her carefully cultivated image of perfection crumbling before our very eyes. "And as for you," Mr. Anderson continued, turning his steely gaze towards my stunned parents, "you should be ashamed of yourselves for enabling Julia's behavior and alienating Claire in the process." Mom opened her mouth to protest, but Mr. Anderson held up a hand, silencing her. "Don't bother denying it. I've seen firsthand how you've dismissed and belittled Claire's gifts, treating her like a pariah while showering Julia with endless praise and attention. Well, no more." He gestured towards me, his expression softening ever so slightly. Claire is an extraordinary young woman whose talents and insights have helped countless people, myself included. She deserves to be celebrated, not shunned by her own family. As his words washed over me, I felt a surge of emotion. Gratitude, vindication, and yes, a twinge of petty satisfaction at seeing Julia's carefully constructed facade finally shattered beyond repair. For years, I had been the outcast, the black sheep forced to bear the brunt of my family's dysfunction and cruelty. But in that moment, the tides had turned, and it was Julia who found herself on the outside looking in, her mask of perfection stripped away to reveal the ugly truth beneath. As the stunned silence gave way to a cacophony of whispers and murmurs, I couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. Finally, after years of suffering in silence, the truth was laid bare for all to see, and Julia had no one to blame but herself. With a deep breath, I straightened my shoulders and held my head high, basking in the knowledge that my long journey towards redemption and acceptance was finally within reach. The path ahead might be uncertain, but one thing was clear. I would never again allow myself to be defined by the cruelty and pettiness of others. From this moment on, I would forge my own destiny, unburdened by the weight of my family's toxic legacy. The weight of the past fell away as I stepped out into the crisp morning air, my meager belongings tucked into a battered suitcase. The door closed behind me with a decisive click, severing the final ties to the toxic environment that had once been my home. As I made my way down the familiar street, I couldn't help but reflect on the tumultuous journey that had led me to this point. The years of neglect and emotional abuse at the hands of my own family, the constant dismissal of my gifts, the unbearable strain of living in Julia's shadow, it all seemed like a distant nightmare, one that I had finally awakened from. The events of Julia's disastrous wedding had been the catalyst, the tipping point that had finally forced me to confront the harsh realities I had spent so long trying to ignore. With Mr. Anderson's support and my newfound confidence, I had mustered the strength to break free from the toxic cycle of manipulation and cruelty that had defined my relationship with my family for far too long. The confrontation had been explosive, a maelstrom of bitter accusations and long-festering resentments finally unleashed. Julia, of course, had been utterly unrepentant, hurling vicious insults and denials even as the evidence of her misdeeds mounted. "You're just jealous that I'm the one who's actually successful and happy," she had spat, her perfect facade now shattered beyond repair. Mom and Dad, meanwhile, had retreated into a defensive silence, their blind loyalty to Julia rendering them incapable of acknowledging the truth that had been laid bare before them. In the end, it had been a lost cause, a family so poisoned by dysfunction and favoritism that they were beyond redemption. And so, with a heavy heart, I had made the decision to walk away, to forge my own path and leave the toxic remnants of my past behind. As I navigated the familiar streets, each step felt lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The future stretched out before me, a blank canvas waiting to be painted with new experiences and possibilities. A small smile tugged at my lips as I thought of Mrs. Reynolds, the woman who had seen my gifts for what they truly were. Not a curse, but a rare and precious talent to be nurtured and embraced. She had promised to help me find my footing, to connect me with others who understood the complexities of empathic abilities. For the first time in my life, I felt a sense of belonging, of being seen and accepted for who I truly was. No longer would I be defined by the cruelty and pettiness of others, but by my own strength and resilience. As I turned the corner, the rising sun cast a warm glow over the city, bathing the world in a soft golden light. It felt like a fitting metaphor for the new chapter unfolding before me, a chance to step out of the shadows and into a future filled with potential and possibility. With a deep breath, I squared my shoulders and pressed onward, the past finally receding into the distance. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew that I was ready to face them head-on, armed with the knowledge that I was no longer alone in this world. For the first time in my life, I was free to embrace my gifts, to forge my own destiny, and to leave the toxic legacy of my family behind once and for all.